Okay, this is part 4 of the lecture. We've discussed the relation between typology and computability. We've discussed the notion of situating patterns from natural language into various types of the computable functions. We've discussed how useful these subclasses of computable functions are for designing experiments in relation to neural network interpretability. And so now I'm going to finish up by discussing some open areas and some general conclusions. Now, the open areas, I hope you've learned this so far, that they can take several different types. They can be empirical, theoretical, or experimental. There are many different open questions. So let's go back and look at this image, which sort of represents the thing that we've arrived at, right? Considering typology through the range of the computable functions has allowed us to refine our notion of computability into increasingly structured subsets, from polyregular to regular to rational and sequential. These represent increasingly restrictive conditions on what it means to be computable, and they correspondingly have restrictions on the type of grammar or automaton or Turing machine that's going to compute these particular functions, from Pebble automata to two-way, one-way FST to deterministic transducers. This encyclopedia of categories allowed us to categorize various types of functions in natural language typology, in particular in phonology and morphology, where I've looked today. Now, the first issue that we can think of is empirical, right? Well, what are things that I left out today? Well, there's syntactic functions, there are semantic functions, there are the rest of the morphological functions, there are the rest of the phonological functions, there are other linguistic processes. So one question is, how fine-grained do we have to be to understand the difference between the typological generalizations made here today and those that we either haven't discovered yet or haven't analyzed yet? There are some very interesting comparisons we can make once we understand typology through the lens of computable functions. One generalization, for example, is that seemingly disparate processes, like suffixation or metathesis or harmony, share similar properties. Similarly, circumambient unbounded harmony, tone plateauing, and dissimulation also share certain properties and differ from properties that, say, metathesis and suffixation have, purely by virtue of falling within the rational or sequential classes. We've also been able to make statements about the difference between attested processes and unattested processes, also by virtue of where they fall into these particular classes. So one issue is, do we have the range right? It seems that when you look at phonological and morphological typology, we can't find anything outside of the regular class. We don't see anything that's polyregular. We certainly don't see anything that's non-polyregular. But the generalization that you might take, which is that everything that is phonological and morphological is regular, is not the situation. That is too strong of a hypothesis. In fact, it's not the hypothesis we want to make at all. All we can say is that given these restrictions on the types of functions, we're able to distinguish certain properties of what it means to, characterize a process such that the process sits inside that particular class. Okay, so based on the definition of what it means to be regular, we've been able to say something like total reduplication is regular, and so is suffixation, and exponential copying is not regular. Okay, now, could it be the case that we find some property that is, or some process in natural language that is non-regular? Absolutely. Is that a problem for this hypothesis? Absolutely not. It does not invalidate any hypothesis about the fact that total reduplication is regular. Even if we seem to find a process like exponential copying that's super robust and exists in, say, 90% of languages that we haven't discovered yet, right? It doesn't mean that total reduplication is not regular, right? It doesn't invalidate the fact, right? So typologists out there, if you have examples of such processes, they are wonderful examples because they enrich our notion of the typology. It allows us to say, what is typology such that it must be polyregular? Right now, we only can consider statements like, what is typology such that it must be regular? Okay? It also influences the learning question, because we might want to know, well, what is a process that's learnable such that it's regular versus polyregular, right? Right now, we're only able to say, well, it seems like learnable processes, if they're going to be those in natural language, are going to be those that are going to sit inside the regular languages. But again, this depends on the data. So this is a direct interaction between the data that you gather, how you describe the phenomenon and how you classify the phenomenon according to this, theoretical law that we've understood, which is the law of computability. The law of computability states that certain things are, computable and certain things are not. Refining it allows you to say certain things are rational and certain things are not. Okay? A second open area is the theoretical area, right? It could be, for example, that we just haven't really gotten a notion of, what's regular right or what's rational right, or we might want to note some more subtlety in between these regions here. It could be that these are too coarse, right? Or that they're too fine. So there's a lot of theoretical work here, especially within the regular functions, understanding more subclasses, more fine-grained subclasses to pick out different properties that are going to structure our typology even further, okay? And again, this can only help. If there's some process, some subclass of the rational functions that we find, this is a very active area of research, right? Understanding the difference between things like sour grapes harmony and circumambient harmony. And so if we find them, again, that doesn't invalidate anything. It just says that there's a more refined notion of what it meant to be a rational function, and thus what it meant to be part of this particular slice of the typology, okay? Now, the final open area is experimental. So I presented a very simple experiment that we did, but there's many more that you could do, right? So we looked at partial versus total reduplication. Now, what about unattested reduplication patterns? How do these attention networks that seem to behave so well on these patterns do with triplication or reverse, palindrome type copying, where you have to reverse the second copy, right? Or, the sort of polynomial copying that we looked at earlier. What we'd also like to do is to test the distinctions using phonological harmony patterns, right? So we like to go down the hierarchy. You could look at syntactic transformations. We'd also like to look at different architectures like transformers, where you just get rid of the recurrence and have just the attention mechanism, etc. Right? So there's a lot to do experimentally, and this is a fertile ground. So that's what I want to emphasize. It's all fertile ground. So as a global summary, I think I gave you three different perspectives here, right? So typological statements emerge from computability. Classes of computable functions give principled explanations for attested and unattested processes. And these functions enable interpretability experiments for machines that we don't really yet understand, but here they allow us to sort of poke in a little bit. The main lessons are that linguists can both contribute here and not just borrow, right? So the processes in natural language typology contribute to the study of computational typology because every example is potentially, very useful. Now, computation and the theory of computation has much to be studied and much to offer linguistic typology. Linguists should be directly engaging with the theory of computation, and particularly the theory of computable functions. And, this is just one of a 1,000 strands. And I really like to get the perspective of letting 1,000 flowers bloom because, computation is everywhere. And I think that once you start looking for it, especially in natural language, it's hard not to find it. So I hope you enjoyed this and that you have lots of questions for me. So thank you.